So before I was a programmer who loved fiber arts, I was a textile designer who really loved computers. And while I was studying textile design, I learned that the history of weaving technology is actually totally critical to the development of computers the way we use them today. And if you've never gotten to experience learning that two things that you really like are actually really closely related when you thought they didn't have anything to do with each other, it's a really awesome feeling and it's super exciting. So what I'm hoping to do is explain a little bit about how weaving works and why I think weaving is cool so that you can understand the relationship between weaving and programming and get to experience a little bit of this excitement for yourself. So what is weaving in the first place? So weaving is one of the most common ways that you can take yarn and turn it into fabric. Knitting is the other one. So knitting uses one really long piece of string and loops and makes it stretchy. Weaving uses lots of different pieces of string and interleaves them together and makes them not stretchy. So your jeans are made out of woven fabric and your t-shirt's probably made out of knitting. There we go. So a woven fabric has two categories of yarn. There's the warp, which goes up and down and is highlighted in blue here, and there are lots of those. They run parallel to each other along the length of a fabric. And then there's the weft, which is usually one really long piece of thread, or maybe multiple pieces of thread to make different colors, that runs back and forth and kind of interlaces its way between the warp threads. If you've ever done this grade school craft project where you cut strips of paper, that's basically weaving. And it's making something like this fabric that's called plain weave. So that's the simplest way you can make a woven fabric. And this is the simplest kind of loom you can have, called a tapestry loom, and it's basically just a frame that holds a bunch of warp threads tight for you. And if you look at this picture, you can get an idea of how slow and tedious making something on a tapestry loom can be. You're just taking your hands and weaving those yarns in yourself, or maybe with like a fork or something. And you can make incredible things this way, but it will take a really, really long time and be really tedious. So people tried to invent looms that were faster and allowed you to make more complicated fabrics more easily. So this is a loom with harnesses, which are basically frames that hold a bunch of warp threads together in a group. And those frames are connected to pedals. So while the weaver is weaving, you can press the pedals in a specific order, and it will lift the frames and allow you to lift different groups of warp threads. But you're still kind of limited in the complexity just because mechanically you can't have that many frames, and you're limited on the number of warp threads you can lift at a time. But in a loom like this, you can basically draw out a plan for how you're going to make a fabric. And this is kind of like source code for a fabric called a draft. In the center of the draft, you have a grid, and that represents each square is an intersection of a warp and a weft thread. So the horizontal rows are one pass of the weft, and each vertical row is a warp. The parts that are red in this drawing are where weft fabric is on top, and the white parts are where warp, or I got that backwards. Weft is on top if it's red, white is on top if it's weft. And if you look at this, you can see that a woven fabric is in a way representable as binary, because basically all you need to know is the warp on top here, or is it underneath the weft? So the top part of this diagram is telling you which harnesses each warp thread should be connected to. So each horizontal row is a harness. The top left part is how you connect the harnesses to the pedals. So that's something you can change depending on what kind of fabric you're trying to make. And then the left side tells the weaver what order to press the pedals in to make the specific pattern. So you can make pretty complicated fabrics this way. There's a lot of different things that are possible, but each time you want to change it, you have to reconfigure the loom. So that involves climbing underneath and hooking up the pedals a different way, or even taking off the warp and rethreading it, which can take hours and is really tedious. And you still can't get something as detailed as a tapestry fabric. So people continue to try and improve this, and a lot of people made efforts, but this was the most successful. This is Joseph Marie Jacquard, and in 1801 he invented a loom that is still called the Jacquard loom. And this is basically what it looked like. It uses a series of punch cards to record which warp thread should be lifted in the pattern. Each warp thread was connected to a hook, and if the hook could poke through a hole in the card, then that warp thread was lifted. So you could control each warp thread individually, and you could change the entire pattern that you were weaving just by swapping out cards without having to make any changes to the loom. And in fact, that picture that I just showed you of jacquard is a jacquard fabric that was woven to show off. So this took 24,000 cards to weave, and I think it was about this tall. But you can also see in this close-up that there are some interesting parallels between like bitmap raster images that we make on computers today and woven fabric. Like there's really a pixel happening here, and there's dithering. And if you have multicolored fabrics, you can use optical mixing to kind of make an illusion of having more colors than you really do. And so if you're familiar with how early computers work, you might see where this connection is about to come together. So here we have Charles Babbage, the English scientist and inventor, and he actually loved this portrait of Jacquard. He owned multiple copies of it, and one of his favorite things to do at parties was show it to party guests and ask them how it was made, and then kind of laugh at them when they guessed wrong, because that was a fabric. So in 1822, he started developing this machine called the difference engine, which could basically do arithmetic. It was totally mechanical, and a lot like early looms, you had to kind of reconfigure the entire machine to do a different calculation. And just so you know, this picture and the next picture, he never managed to finish these, but people have created replicas of them in modern time, and they actually do work. So he wasn't happy with that, and so in 1837, he started this new project called the analytical engine, which would be much more general purpose. And so the analytical engine also used punch cards for input, and Babbage wrote that he was directly inspired by Jacquard's looms using punch cards as well. The analytical engine used two different sets of punch cards. One was the input, basically variables in your program, and the other was the operation, so you could change the input and the operation independently. Ada Lovelace was also really interested in Jacquard looms and the analytical engine. She translated an Italian paper on the analytical engine and wrote a lot of notes that actually ended up being much longer than the paper itself. Her notes included the first computer program and also some suggestions for improving Jacquard looms by making them capable of doing loops, much like a computer program would. It also includes this awesome quote that is basically the thesis of my talk. We may say most aptly that the analytical engine weaves algebraical patterns just as the Jacquard loom weaves flowers and leaves. But then there's kind of a pause in the development of computers for a while. Charles Babbage lost funding and never finished either of his machines, and Ada Lovelace died young, so nothing happened for about 100 years. But then we have this guy, Herman Hollerith, whose brother just happened to own a Jacquard mill in New York. And in 1889, he invented this machine that he called the tabulating machine that used punch cards to record information and like calculate sums. So it was used in the 1890 census, and each person in the census would have a card, and you could feed this into the machine, and it would tell you like how many people were male or how many people were female. And it would do all this much faster than previous, which was just done by clerks, like hundreds of clerks in a room for months and months. So he sold this machine to this company called the Computing Tabulating Reporting Company. But it turned out that this machine that he built was the most successful product they had, and they decided to change their name in 1924 to a company that will probably be more familiar to you, IBM. So IBM sold punch card machines for a really long time, like well into the 1980s. And in the 30s, they were selling 3 billion punch cards a year, and their machines could process 30,000 cards an hour. Just as an aside, if you've ever wondered why 80 characters is the default width for a terminal, it's because these punch cards have 80 columns on them. So after that, there's a lot of other advances in computing that you're probably more familiar with, like that's ENIAC and the personal computer. Then we get to smartphones and all that stuff. But actually, we can bring things back to weaving again, because once computers existed, then computers could be brought back to help weavers make more awesome things too. So in 1983, the first computerized Jacquard loom was invented. And so I've actually worked on designing these, and this picture does not do justice to how gigantic this is. Like if you look at the ladder, you can see that that's like twice the height of a person. And the looms like run their own versions of Unix and have hard drives and all this stuff. There's super elaborate CAD software that allows you to design fabrics like this. And the combination of weaving and computers together allows you to make like really beautiful, complicated things that you'd never make with those two things separate. So I hope you enjoyed this little bit of computing history and fiber nerdery. Thank you.